Welcome to the Australian Water School free webinar series. What a topic this is going to be. Flood Modelling 101. Presenters Bill Simon, Pavlina Monatova and their colleagues will introduce in a moment. This is a webinar sponsored by 2Flow, a well-recognised international water modelling team. Have a look at the number of people on board today. 1,300 from over 80 countries, and we're so glad you've joined us. I think this is going to be a very full discussion. This is going to be great. Thanks for joining us, everyone from all around Australia. It's so good to have you. I'd like to ask a very simple question. Why this topic? What do you think, Bill? Big topic.
It's well, I love teaching people. I love seeing young modelers coming through and teching them. And I've been doing this for nearly 40 years. So it's time for me to pass on my knowledge. And that's
lots of experience.
Yeah.
And Pavlina?
I always enjoyed spending time around water and making small dams from sand and stones, breaking them, watching how the water flows.
That's a great That's a really great background. You get it right in your soul, don't you? You really understand the problem. Yeah. And yourself, Chris?
I'm a little bit like Bill. Just enjoy. I do like everything flooding, but also enjoy teaching. This year rings in 20 years for me of flood modelling.
You don't like everything flooding, but you would like to understand what goes on when it begins to flood. Yeah. And Philip, all good?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've been lucky enough to have mentors like Bill and have learned a lot from my mentors over the years. So I guess it's nice to be able to be in a format that we can pass some of that on.
What a fantastic team. I mean, there's actually 8 people on board here for you today, everyone, from the Australian Water School team and the 2Flow team. We want to give this all we've got and hope that you really get something from it. Bill's going to kick off with a few thoughts and then hand over to Pavlina, and then Pavlina back to Bill. And then after that, Chris, if you could take over to moderate the Q&A afterwards. Over to you,
Awesome.
Bill.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And it's nice to get back to basics. So that's pretty much what this webinar is about. So the first part, I'm just going to go over what I feel are the sort of the fundamentals of what we need as flood modelers. And it's good to understand why we do it. A bit of history is always useful. And I'm not going to get into the depths of solving the physics. I'm just going to really try and highlight things that I feel are needed for people to try and appreciate and understand, and they can dive into the depths later on. So, and always, you need to know whether what you're doing is right. It's very important. And I'll just touch a little bit on quality assurance and community consultation. Following that, Pavlina will actually run through some nice simple examples on those topics there, just to give you a bit of a taste for the sorts of things you should be doing and checking when you're doing your modelling. So flood modelling, why do we do it? It has to be a reason why we do this. And when I made this slide the other day, I thought, well, actually, it's basically just informing the decision makers. We, as flood modelers, we don't obviously make decisions about our modelling, but we don't make the important decisions. That's sort of left to the people we're informing. It could be government, it could be authorities, emergency managers, might be talking with a developer about why they really can't fill that whole floodplain. So we're informing them, and so we're providing guidance to where and how to build. We often are asked to send through metrics. What is the flood risk for people, the infrastructure, the economy? And that could also be social risks as well as the financial risks. And we're often asked to evaluate what measures will reduce those flood risks. Let's put a levy in here. Yep. What about improving community education? What do we need to do around that? And so our modelling, this feeds into all of that. So as part of development assessments or changes to catchment land use or climate change, we're often trying to evaluate the change in flooding. What is the flood impact from those things? Once again, that gets fed through to your client. And the other area, of course, is during a flood event, or maybe in preparation for a real flood event, we need to advise emergency managers either in advance through pre-modelling or actually during a flood event as it's happening. They are often looking for our advice. So look, the key message here is that basically whatever we're doing with our flood modeling, it's the accuracy of our flood modeling that directly impacts the quality of that decision making. So that's forefront of mind, is the better our accuracy, the better the decisions. A brief history. Well, I could go on about this for a long time. But obviously before computers, people have been playing around with water for a long time. And I mean, here in my home country, you only have to look at some examples that the Indigenous people, First Nations people have been doing for many years, thousands of years. And this is fish traps on the Barina, on Barwon River, the Barina fish traps. And obviously they would have been watching the water, they would have been feeling it, they would have been watching the fish, that wouldn't have just happened with any fancy modeling. They would have designed that by observation and feel. Same with the Romans. I mean, when you start reading about the aqueducts that they built and the distances that they transported that water over, I'm pretty sure they didn't have any fancy hydraulic equations or Manning's ends or computers, of course. They somehow did all that. It's just amazing what they did in terms of transporting water. So look, we've been playing around with water for a long time, but it wasn't really until computers came in that our industry sort of took off. And what computers allowed us to do is obviously do lots of number crunching. So rather than doing it by hand. And so the first models that sort of rule flood modeling were what we call 1D models. And so basically we're making a network of channels. So we've got a flow path down the floodplain here. We've got a flow path down the river. And each of those lines, if you like, each channel would have a cross section or cross sections associated with it. So that's the profile of the river, profile of the floodplain. And obviously water can interact between the floodplain and river. So that's sort of what we call network 1D models. And they became the mainstay of flood modeling. And over time, we developed ways of looking at the results. So if you've got good eyes, you'll see there's a flood level there, and you've got some arrows with, in this case, flows. So that's sort of how we would look at our models digitally. That's how we used to work with our models, and that's where I cut my teeth. And sometimes we cut it pretty hard because there's a lot of paper involved, and this was not an uncommon place for my head to end up at the end of the day. And then in the late 90s, things started to change. 2D, which had been evolved from the coastal modeling area, started to be used for flood modeling. And through the 2000s, early 2000s, it started to really totally dominate, certainly here in Australia. It does vary from country to country. But basically what was happening was that we were going from a situation where we've got this is a highway here, we've got a creek, we've got a lake here, it's all bundled off with this levee. And so as modelers, we had to try and imagine where the floodwaters would go, and you'd have to create a 1D sort of channel network to represent those flow paths. And so it was, that's what we did. It was pretty awkward, but you really had to think about where the flow would go, and that's how you would structure your model. When we move into 2D world, it is so easy. You basically just make your 2D model. There's obviously some decisions that need to be made about your element size, but we suddenly have the ability to feel where the water is going, to see where the water is going according to your model. And then you could, of course, compare that with what's on the ground and the data you have from that site. And so there's a huge jump in the ability for us to go from basically a very awkward set of numbers, often on paper at the beginning, to something where we are actually feeling how the water's flowing. So you can see it coming through the lake there, across the levee, through this bridge structure, and so forth. There's a culvert here, so you can see a little bit of water flowing through that culvert. Yeah, really, really nice. And the lessons learned from that period were that basically, once 2D models started to be used, they were definitely more accurate than 1D models. But computers were still pretty slow, and so being practical meant you could only make small 2D models, so you had to be pretty selective about where and how you made your 2D models. And that was always a challenge until we got 1D 2D linking into the flood game. Once again, this started with coastal modeling here in Australia in the early 90s. But as we moved into the flood world, 1D 2D linking became an absolute game changer. So at that time, 2D models were very small and coarse, so a big model was 50,000 elements. And so what we were able to do was to carve the flow paths, which are too narrow for the 2D, through a 2D domain. So here we have 1D channels and got cross sections, and you can have pipe networks sitting underneath, interacting with your overland area. And that was just fantastic because it allowed us to model sites like the one on the screen there with 2D for the overland areas and 1D down the main channel. And we're talking, this is a concrete line channel moving at 5-6 meters per second. So this is a really, really rigorous test case, but you can see how the 1D velocities are coming down there. Water is spilling out onto the 2D floodplain. You see the red lines are the contours for the flood level. So you can see there's quite a variation in contours. And so it really allowed us to get 2D into areas that we just couldn't do because our model resolutions were too coarse and the computers were too slow. So the key learnings were that, basically 1D, 2D linking allowed us to really move forward by embedding 2D models inside broad-scale models and to represent those narrow flow paths, which were just too narrow to represent realistically or practically in 2D. So 2D went through this sort of big change, dominance, and this is a sort of an overall slide that started way back there, and this is the number of cells. And so in more recent times, we're now seeing models which, in fact, we're seeing models over 1 billion cells, and that's due to this big jump in 2003 to 2013, where GPU technology came in. But it's been this sort of general progression, and 2D is just increasingly dominated and totally dominates flood modeling these days, has done for some time. But that's all sounds really good, but have these models got better? Well, it's interesting to look at this because in my view, having watched this for a long time, is that, well, in the early days, the accuracy was pretty much right up there. It was done with some pretty elegant mathematics. It's what they're using what we call second order solution to the finite difference of finite element normally equations. And they included all the physical terms because it came from a coastal background where you needed to have inertia and turbulence and lots of those fancy things. But as time has gone on, we now have lots of 2D schemes. You have a huge choice of 2D schemes out there. And look, some of those, the dominant one these days is explicit second order finite volume because they can be parallelized onto GPU cards and so forth. And they'll use all the key terms in the equations. But there's also lots of very simple 2D schemes. There's some schemes that are basically the 1D solution over a 2D grid. Some don't have all the terms and some are just first order. So you have a huge choice in schemes, but you also have a very wide range in accuracy. So you have to know what you're doing. And if you're in this space here, you can pretty well make any flood model with confidence. But if you're in this space here, you need to understand those limitations. So learn about your software solution. And as a modeler, particularly a new modeler, you need to run tests to check your models are okay. And that way you get a feel for things. Really, really important. So let's look at some of the high-level fundamentals around solving the physics. The first thing to realize that the physics that's important varies depending on what sort of flow you're trying to model. So if you're trying to represent the flow in that image up there, it's what we would call fairly gentle flow. It's nothing too vigorous. It's what subcritical. And in those areas, or what we might be a backwater area, the inertia of the water is hardly important, as is the turbulence. It's just not important. So you can, it's what I call storage dominated flow. So it's the amount of water that area can hold that really dominates the height of the water. And that's where the mass balance equation, basically what comes in, there's what goes out is the change in the water level in that area. So it's a very simple equation and we never have any problems with that equation. But you start to move, this is the same catchment as that one, a little bit away from here. You've actually got a hydraulic jump forming in this concrete line channel, which is just moving, the water's moving at horrendous speeds. And you're going from supercritical flow to subcritical flow. You've even got big elevation of water, kinetic energy down there. You can see that with the spout of water there. And so you've got very fast moving water, and it's what I call conveyance dominated flow. So really the amount of storage, you could double the storage in your model in this channel and you really wouldn't see any change in results. So it's all about getting the water down that channel accurately. And so that's where the momentum equation controls things. So let's just look at that a little bit deeper. So in the top right hand one there, you can actually basically get rid of the inertia term, get rid of the turbulence term, and you don't need any other forces. And what you end up with is basically what we call the diffusive wave solution, which is mass balance plus gravity plus bed resistance. So basically gravity is pushing the water down and the surface of the water is resisting that to some degree. So that's what we have for that top diagram. But if you move into the bottom diagram space, you really do need all those terms in the momentum equation and potentially other forces as well. So the diffusive wave solution just is not the place to be. You need to be in a full dynamic solution if that is what you're trying to model. So the one thing I've really emphasized over the years is important to appreciate what physical terms are important and where and when they're important. The other thing to learn is to understand the energy of water. So I'm talking about the V squared, the kinetic energy component, the V squared on 2G. So I like this little photo to demonstrate that. So basically the water level, or the total energy is water level plus the V squared on 2G, the kinetic energy. So basically what we're seeing here is this is the water surface slope there, just as the water before it spills over. There's your total energy, which is sort of, let's assume, fairly constant. And the difference is the V squared on 2G. So basically what happens is as water slows down as it approaches like a pier or something like that, you'll often see the water level flatten out or it may even rise. And so that's because your V squared on 2G is reducing as your velocity slows down. So your water surface pops up. And where your water speeds up, your V squared on 2G increasing and the water level drops. So that's why this is important. It's all about energy dissipation because that's driven by the V squared. And so that'll appear in your Manning's formula for bed resistance. It also appears in the turbulence side of the equation. And it's important because if you just even think about it, it's not V, it's V squared. So if you've got water moving at 1 meter per second, that's around 5 centimeters of kinetic energy that's available to be lost by hitting an obstruction and going around the bend or whatever. But if your water's moving at 4 meters per second, it's not 4 times as much, it's actually 16 times as much energy to be expended available through some sort of change in the flow pattern. So it's the essence here, or the really important thing to appreciate is that it's really, really important to calculate the velocity as being super accurate if you're going to model more complex hydraulics. So accurate calculation of the velocity is paramount. So when you're talking about energy dissipation, basically as water moves down, it doesn't really like being told to change direction or to expand. And so it tends to lose its energy as heat when that happens. And you can see in that diagram there. And that can be through bed friction. Manning's equation is the most common form to represent that. And turbulence. So that's where the water is shearing against itself or big eddies are forming and so forth. So you'll get that at constriction, such as in the diagram there, also at bends and so forth. As modelers, you have to realize that 1D can't model turbulence. And that's, so it just can't handle that. It's unidirectional. It has no idea what's going on either side of it. But 2D can model that turbulence to a certain degree, but it won't pick up anything in the third dimension, the vertical, which does occur. If you've got a pier inside your 2D element, your size of your elements are just not going to be good enough to pick up that turbulence. So you lose some energy loss that way, but the 2D turbulence term won't represent that. And so, and there's a subgrid turbulence. And what we're talking about there is the churn of the water below the size of your elements. So look, the takeaways here are 1D can't model turbulence. So that's why we need energy loss coefficients at structures and bends. And that's why we punch those numbers into 1D models. 2D models a lot of turbulence, but it can't model all the turbulence. So you do need to be cognizant of that fact. So how do you know something, what you're doing is right? How do you know it's right? I guess I learned that the hard way, but I learned it a long time ago, which is pretty nice. I remember very, very vividly going to my supervisor. I actually had got TwoFlow running back in 1989. And I said to him, I've got it running, check out these cool results. And I had these lovely images of these velocity things going back. And that was back a long time ago before we had anything fancy like we do today. And my supervisor, Professor Appelt, just said to me, well done, but how do you know it's right? And I just went, yeah. It was a real learning curve. And so ever since then, I've had a real obsession about, if you like, demonstrating that your model is okay. And it's quite enlightening to look at what happened back in 1889. So Robert Manning, and that's the Manning of Manning's equation, big influence on our industry 130 years later. So this is from his original, this is when he's presenting his work to the Institute of Civil Engineers. And, and this is a review by this guy down here, Vernon Harcourt. And there's the equation. It's a nice simple form, so big tick, and gives good results, much more simple form than other things they had at the time. But it basically, what was really important to this guy, and also the other three panelists, was that its results, it needs to concord with experimental data or measured data from a river system. So, you can have a fantastic formula, but if it's not exact, you need to make sure that what you're doing concords with real world known data. So effectively, Manning's formula is a very simple representation of a very complex process. So it's not a precise equation. So that's really important to realize that. It's just a way of helping to estimate the amount of bed resistance. And so those words, in concordance with experiments, it needs to agree with experimental data or measured data over a wide range. So we're not just talking about one instance, we're talking from a flume test, for example, up to a large river. So they're still true today because we do not have an exact solution to our equations. We can't just always be precise. And no model ever precisely reproduces reality because it never will be a perfect representation. So we need to benchmark our data. So let's just look at a little example. So this is one of my favorites. It's certainly it's a Brisbane River data set. It's without doubt, in my career, the most excellent and comprehensive data set that I've ever seen or haven't had the privilege of working with. It covers a wide range of floods. But what's really special about the Brisbane River data set is that the three of those floods, they actually measured flows very close to just upstream of the CBD. So they had a very good idea of how much water is actually flowing down that river system. And that's really rare in our industry. We often have lots of water level recordings, but we don't have, and we might have some rainfall recordings, but it's very rare that we have really good measured flows at high floods. Yeah, very unusual. And so we're just going to look at this gauge here, Mogul, which is 75 kilometers up. This is the ocean here. So we're going up 75 kilometers. The river is still tidal at that point. And in 2011, roughly a 1 in 100 event, the peak was 18 meters above that tide. So that's a long way above tide level. So here's some gauge diagrams. So there you can see the tide here during the 2011 event. And the blue line is what was recorded in 2011. So you can see the blue line going like that. So that's actually the water level recorded at the Mogul gauge. Now, one of the first things we did in the Brisbane River flood study was let's just see what's involved in matching that gauge up there, because it's a pretty important gauge. So we built our first pass on the model. We ran the minor floods through, and we found we needed a Manning's N of about 0.038. to match the peaks of the minor floods, but also there's this post-flood releases, and several of the floods have this, where the releases from Wivenhoe Dam, which is about half the catchment, are just held constant. And that's another really key measurement, because they know pretty much exactly how much water they're releasing during that post-flood period. So the 0.038 matched reasonably well, a little bit high than the blue line there. We then ran the two major floods, and one on the screen is one of them. And we found that a slightly higher Manning's End was needed to match the flood peak up here. So that's the orange line. Anyway, so they're not too different. 0.038, 0.041 is probably quite acceptable. But, you know, that's fine. The only other sort of thing to observe here is that the timing of the two peaks is not great. I love matching the timing. If you get the timing right, that means you're getting the speed of the wave coming down right, and that's really, really important. And so you see here that the orange and green lines at 0.038 and 0.041 are just about 6 hours ahead of the peak. So they're just sending the water down a bit too early. The other red flag here, because being an experienced modeler, I guess, is 0.038 to 0.041 is actually way too high for a tidal river embank Manning's End. You know, typically we see values around 0.02 to 0.03, more around the 0.022 to 0.025. So that's a bit of a red flag. You know, so we've got some pretty high Manning's Ends here to calibrate this gauge. Something might not be quite right. And if you're stuck with 0.038 or 0.041 for the rest of your modeling, you would be horrendously wrong. And why? Because there's a stack more data downstream, which we hadn't looked at yet. And so what you're looking at here is a profile. This is going to the Brisbane CBD. These are bridges here. The bridge decks are the black lines there. Purple dots are gauges, so they're pretty precise. The green dots are in-bank good observations. And the blue dots are flood levels out in the floodplain, so they will be somewhat different to the level in the river, but they give us a bit of a guide. And so you can see there that the Manning's End of 0.038 and 0.041 is about 2 meters too high through the CBD. So that's not a good outcome. What is going on? So we did something which I've done on other models, and we switched to just using a standard Manning's End and using energy losses at the bends. Brisbane River has quite a lot of bends, sharp bends. It's not a slow meandering system. And so let's have a look how that went. So that's where we were before. And the red dash line is using a Manning's End of 0.022 and bend losses at the bends. So we're getting a really nice reproduction of the 2011 flood at the flood peak. The timing is very nice. And we get the post dam release is really good. And we ran this through the other 3 minor floods and the other major flood, and also just tidal signal is nice and healthy. And so we actually got a really good calibration to all 5 flood events, the tide, using the one set of parameters. And so you can see back here, if I just dive back, so you can see this red line is what we get from the profile. So we ended up with a really, really nice calibration, that one set of parameters. And look, the moral here is that you just got to be very wary of using non-industry standard Manning's End values. They're not real, and they are always an indicator that something else is wrong. So that's the thing you always have to have in your mind. So those previous slides were from a 1D only model. What about 2D? And so this is the same.
Maybe, Chris, you could step in.
Okay, all right. I'm somewhat winging this because I've only seen the slides once for about 10 minutes, but we'll see how we go. Look, from memory with this study, Bill and Phil did the work where they first developed a 1D model and also then developed a 2D model, and they found that calibration for the 1D required energy loss inputs at all of those river bends, where there's the 90 degree and 180 degree river bends. Now, to convert that model to 2D, they also had to put energy loss inputs into the model, because the 2D solution is only accounting for energy losses in the horizontal, not in the vertical. But it's worth noting that those energy loss values were significantly less. So you can see there for the 180-degree bend, the 1D solution required an energy loss value of 1.5, and for the 2D, a value of approximately 20% of that, or down to 0.3 V squared on 2G was required, and half that number for the 90-degree bends. Yeah, and so just to reiterate what I sort of touched on a second ago, now the reason why you need these additional inputs to account for energy losses in the 1D and the 2D solutions is in 1D, it doesn't take any account for those at all, so you need to manually specify it. In 2D, the scheme is accounting for energy losses in the horizontal, so moving left and right, but not in the vertical, so not as you move up and down the water column. So that vertical loss needs to be accounted for via manual specification of these inputs. Very good take-home message from that modelling was that you could actually achieve a reliable result using the same Manning's-N value for the 1D solution and the 2D solution, as long as you did include those additional bend loss inputs. So there was no need for different values there. Let's now look at a bit of a benchmark test case for that same catchment. We've got some recorded flood levels there highlighted with black dots, and the levels that were recorded for the 2011 event at looks like half a dozen different locations. Now, if we just focus on the Brisbane City gauge and also that long section, we can use a comparison between different solutions that are available. And I guess the hard thing for someone who's a young modeler is to understand, okay, which one is right, which one is wrong. There's a couple of ways you can do that. It's by comparing your results to theory, flume measurements, calibration data, and also comparison against solvers that you trust. So stepping back one slide, we focus on that long section first, which is the yellow line. This graph here shows a second order solution, which is the green line going from upstream to downstream. You've got a black cross, often above the line, and a black minus below the line. The black crosses are on the outside of the bend and the minuses are on the inside of the bend. So you get super elevation of the water going around those bends. So you're expecting a result that's down the center line of the river to actually fall within those two ranges.
Bill, are you, sorry to break in, Chris.
Sorry.
Oh, great.
No, that's all right.
Sorry about that, everyone. I'm not sure what happened there.
Relieve Chris from that, that'd be great.
Okay, so yeah, so when we look at this profile here, you can see the second order solution is coming down quite nicely, matching the flood levels, with the ones on the outer side of the bend higher than the ones on the inside of the bend. But when you run first order, you see this elevated water surface through here. It just doesn't match the measured values very well at all. And so what you're getting here is this first order numerical error kicking in, which is tends to be more pronounced in more complex flow situations. And also what's interesting is to calibrate that first order solution, we needed a very low Manning's-N 0.018, which once again is unrealistic and is ringing alarm bells. So that Manning's-N value really has to sit within industry standards. So just to continue on there. Yeah, so when we look at the time history at that gauge, so here we have the first order solution, and we've run this model for different cell resolutions, so 60, 50, 40, 30, and 20. So just to compare the results, the black line here is the recorded time history from the flood, 2011. But you can see there, all those different resolutions are giving quite different results. And as you would expect, the coarser cell sizes are giving the higher elevations. And so what we're seeing here is what we call not very good cell size results convergence. So what cell size results convergence from the best test you can ever do tells you is whether you've got convergence. Basically, the first thing is your cell size too large? And once your results stop changing, that means you're down to a nice cell size to do your modeling at. But it's also characteristics of schemes which are struggling to converge very well, so into a solution. So you'll see that more pronounced in the first order solution. So if you look at the first order solution, now we look at the second order solution, you can see that the different model cell sizes are more tightly spaced. Once again, the 60 meter is sort of sitting outside the others. So that's really saying we need to be, certainly less than 60 meter cell size for this large river system. But you could probably run this model quite comfortably at the 30 meter or even maybe the 40 meter with a second order solution. The other thing is that these runs were carried out with just a single elevation point per cell center and on the cell sides. So that's what we call no subgrid sampling. One of the more recent developments has been subgrid sampling, and that really, what that does is it gives all the information sitting inside a cell is stored as storage curves and conveyance curves on the faces. So we're getting a more precise representation when water is below the highest elevation point in the cell. And this is what we get. We get a really, subgrid sampling really does further improve your cell size results convergence to the point where this model, you can literally run it at 60 meters and you'll get very similar results to what you get at 20 meters. And that has a big impact on your run times. Your run times just become very, very fast and you are getting good, strong, reliable results. Okay, so quality assurance. What are the key points when it comes to quality controlling your model? Basically, look, it's quite simple. It's just basically garbage in, garbage out. It's, you feed bad data into your model, you're going to get inaccurate results come out. And sometimes if you're just doing very high level modeling, you just want to get a feel where the water's going, and you're not going to use it for council planning purposes. You're not going to use it for setting building floor levels, or you're not going to do an impact assessment. That could be fine, having inaccurate data feeding in. You just want to get a feel where things go. But if you want really accurate data to feed through to your decision makers, you need to have good input data. So I really can't emphasize the importance of this. I just can't emphasize it enough. And so just some examples of what garbage, if you like, is obviously inaccurate topographic data is probably the big number one. If you feed in poor elevation data or poor bathymetry data, and of course your modeling is not going to be particularly accurate. The other big one, of course, is there's often hydraulic controls such as road embankments, railway embankments, levees, and so forth, stop banks. So they have a big influence on how the water moves around. So they must be enforced. You must make sure the crest of those hydraulic controls is represented in your model. As I've already talked a few times, is unrealistic bed resistance values is always a red flag to something else being wrong. So if you're finding through calibration or other ways you're having to use unusual Manning's N values, just stop and look at everything else first. If you don't have the luxury of being able to calibrate your model, just stick with industry standard values. Don't deviate from those. Unrealistic form loss values. Once again, this is a bit of a difficult one for our industry because there isn't a lot of guidance in terms of these. But what's come out of the Brisbane River study and other studies and a lot of flume testing we've been doing, you can get a good handle of the bend loss or the energy losses at bends and so forth. And also structures are often well documented in that regard. So the only thing to be careful of is in 2D world, because it actually is modeling quite a lot of those energy losses, but you might need to add some additional energy loss due to the vertical and other things that the 2D resolution is not good enough to pick up. Boundaries, possibly the biggest source of uncertainty is often the inflows you're putting into your model. That will probably come from hydrological modeling. It might come from, wherever. But basically, that is often where your greatest uncertainty is in terms of the accuracy of how either your calibration event or your design event. But by and large, we have to run with the standards that our country has. So in Australia, Australian rainfall and runoff, and so that does take a lot of the pressure out of this point. But yeah, particularly if you're calibrating, just be aware that the inflows that you're putting into your model often have a lot of uncertainty, and that's why the Brisbane River study was so good, because there's little uncertainty in the inflows. Stage discharge boundaries, they need to be well downstream of your area of interest, and Pavlina will show an example around that. Poor boundary configuration. We've often seen the boundaries not digitized very well or placed in poor locations. So once again, Pavlina will talk a little bit about that. And structures, well, that's probably several webinars, to be honest. And there's a few webinars we've previously given listed there. I won't delve into structures in this, but once again, if you represent a structure badly, that's going to also reflect in the accuracy of your modeling. But ultimately, it's all about looking at your results. Please, please, please spend time looking at your results, but particularly with today's super stable schemes. What I really like doing is just panning around, looking at how the water's moving around. Imagine you're there, you're a kayak or something, going down the river. And I always tend to put on velocity arrows, and I like to show water level contours at a constant interval, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 of a meter interval, and put some depth shading so I can see where the water is deep. The other thing too is that any time spent on site is so invaluable, and talk with the locals if you can. They know how it floods. Appreciate the scale. So the Brisbane River is a 30-meter deep, very wide river system. So 0.1 of a meter change in the Brisbane River is tiny, whereas 0.1 of a meter change in a small urban environment is big. So, you know, we often think about change as being absolute, but I think we also think about it in terms of the relative scale of that change. And watch how the water flows when you're out, when you get out. If you ever had the chance to look at a flood waters, go watch it, look at it, get a feel for it. It's fascinating. And so when I say look at your results, here's a nice little example. So here's some results from a model simulation. You see the blue lines are water level contours, the arrows there are the velocity. It's in an urban environment, and we're getting these high velocities at different sections of the road, which to me just doesn't look right, because this is unless there's a speed bump there or something there to cause that high velocity, just doesn't look right. And then okay, let's look at the underlying data. And this has got the DEM with those velocities on top. And you see there's this big drop in the DEM at these locations. Once again, that's certainly not there. It's a road. It's like having a cliff in your road. And so we looked further and found that DEM had been created from contours. So here's the 2-foot contours. And so the tin that was used to create the DEM just interpolated across that contour there. And so this section here ended up dead flat, and then jumped down to the next dead flat section. So this was a very good example of putting garbage in, garbage coming out. Okay, I'll just wrap up with community consultation and a quick little story. So community consultation is really important. And this animation that should be showing on your screen now was the first time I ever used 2D results in a community meeting. And up until that point, the community have been quite skeptical, negative. We've been using 1D modeling, and trying to show people 1D modeling is just a nightmare, I can tell you. You got the local farmers there, and they just look at it and go, ugh. And so this is the first time I ever showed some 2D modeling back in 1999. So as you were seeing, the flood is coming down from the top left of the thing, coming through this sort of gorge through Casino, the township Casino in northern New South Wales. It's a big river system, very fast moving. And I'm just showing this video, and this guy just gets up and walks up on stage and starts pointing to the screen. Okay, oh, what's going on here? This is, I'm a young engineer, and he's this big beefy farmer coming up onto the screen. And he says, he points to where that yellow circle is. He says, this is where my family home washed away in 1954. And sure enough, if you look at the results there, you've got high velocities cutting across this meander and flowing out around about here. And so his family home was washed away. He was a kid at the time. And then he kept looking at it, and he said, oh yeah, the flow goes down here and then across here and ends up at this island here, which is this sort of little island that ends up in the middle of the floodplain. And he said, that's where my brother was found alive the next morning after clinging to the fridge all night. The fridge floated, and his brother ended up attached to it. And he just turned around to the audience and said, this model is right. And he sat back down. And I'm just going, wow. But the thing that really what happened at that point onwards is that the community were totally on board. They were just no longer skeptical, and the interaction was fantastic. So yeah, bring the community on board if you can, because they'll also tell you where the model is wrong. And that's happened to me many, many times. So listen to them. The other nice little, to finish off, I got this photo in the post a few days later, or some days later. And it was a photo of his house taken after the 54 flood. So there's a house that was washed away, and miraculously his brother ended up on the fridge and survived. So on that basis, I'm going to hand over to Pavlina. Hopefully I'm still online and you're seeing all this. Over to you, Pavlina.
Thank you, Bill. The second half of the presentation will be on some tips and tricks. We will have a look at the model resolution, external boundaries, material spatial resolution, break lines, and culvert quality assurance. The first assumption for model resolution is you should get hydraulically at least 4 to 5 cells across the main channel. And if you are using a subgrid sampling and fine resolution DEM, you can get away with less cells. Here is an example model. If we zoom into this location and run the model with 10-meter resolution, this is how it would look like: 5 meter, 2.5 meter, and 1.25 meter. So based on the rule of thumb, the first two are not really complying. If you are going down too fine, you should note that cell size should not be smaller than your DEM resolution, because you would not get any benefit from it. The next assumption is to review your result resolution is appropriate to the modeling task. Here we have results contained within the main channel for all these 4 cell sizes. And the finer the cell size, the nicer the results look like. Although you can easily process high resolution output for water level and depth based on underlying DEM, you will still get only a single velocity value across the whole cell. This is demonstrated by the velocity vectors on all these plots. So if your project requires high velocity resolution output, you might need to choose smaller cell size. But using smaller cell size comes with longer run times. For example, here we have 10 meter running in 24 seconds, 5 meter in 39 seconds. If you go lower, then you can finally see some simulation runtime increase. 2.5 meter model runs in over 2 minutes, and 1.25 meter model runs in over 23 minutes. You can also reduce the runtime using quadtree with larger base cell size. Quadtree divides cell into 4, and it's very easily to set up by digitizing a polygon in locations where you want your cell size to get smaller. If we zoom in again to our location and use 10 meters as the base cell size, then we can refine our model, the main creek, to 5 meters, 2.5 meters, and 1.25 meters. How would the results look using quadtree grid? They would look very similar to the previous one. You might see an odd pixel here and there in the results when the flow contained within the creek is getting to the larger cell size. The results are looking similar, but you should get quite significant speed up in the run times. The 5 meter is 4% faster, 2.5 meter is 9% faster, but where you actually will see much faster modeling runtimes is for bigger models. So the 1.25 meter model runs 31% faster, and that's still a model that is not that big. It only ran for 23 minutes with the uniform cell size. You might have models that run for an hour, hours, days, weeks. Then if you use quadtree, you can get significant speed up if you use it appropriately. Until now, I have shown you flow contained within the main channel, but how would it actually look like if we get the flow spilled out of the banks? I have a short animation here with uniform grid with 10 meters on the left side and quadri grid 10, 5, and 2.5 meters on the right side. So let's start the simulation. Already on the right side, the flow is going through the creek much faster because it's not choking. On the elevation, choke points same as the uniform grid. But once we get to the floodplain spill, the 10-meter grid size seems to be fairly appropriate. This works really nice if we have fine resolution DEM. What if we don't have that? What if we have poor bathymetry data or coarse DEM that looks like this? It just almost hurts the eyes to even look at it. What are the options? The first one is to use 1D open channel, where you need to have your cross-sections surveyed, set up the main channel path and the banks as the 1D, 2D boundaries. Who has previously set up a 1D open channel knows it's quite time-consuming exercise to get the setup right and to make it work correctly. So the second option would be to use high-resolution bathymetry survey and stamp your bathymetry survey on top of the coarse resolution grid. With this, you can then use quadri to refine the in-channel resolution. The last point for the model resolution assumptions is to conduct cell size convergence. On the first plot here, I have run 4 cell sizes without subgrid sampling. And from the plot, you can see only the first 2 fine cell sizes are converging nicely, meaning they are pretty much lying on top of each other. So you would be limited to using 1.25 or 2.5 meter cell size. If we run the same model with subgrid sampling, this converging is much nicer for all of the models. In this case, we can use the 5-meter model, which sits almost on top of the smaller cell size resolutions. So you are saving some runtime using bigger cell size. Let's now dive into external boundaries assumptions. The water level should be horizontal, boundary should be in confined space, and it should span from high ground to high ground. I have created these 4 plots, and plot number 1 pretty much complies with all the assumptions, so that would be a nice location for the external boundary. Plot number 2 has not been digitized perpendicular to the flow. And if you see on the water level here, there is a bit of super elevation happening on the outer bank of the channel. So this is not a great location for boundary. Same with plot number 3. We are getting flows from the higher grounds that overtopped the road coming into the channel, and it's far from horizontal. Plot number 4 does look, the water level does look more or less horizontal, but it's not wide enough to go from high ground to high ground. So this is also not a good location for external boundary. I have mentioned that boundary should be perpendicular to the flow. Let's look at an example. On the results here, I have displayed water depth with velocity vectors and water level contours every 0.2 meters. The boundary seemed to be working nicely, but what if we set it up not to be perpendicular to the flow? The results would look odd. There will be water coming out on an angle from the boundary, and that's not what you want to achieve. Another assumption, another recommendation would be to snap your boundary to the model area, which is represented by the green polygon. If we don't snap it, you would get flow coming out of the boundary both ways, filling up the space between the boundary and your model area. Not a desirable boundary. Last recommendation is to digitize the boundary wide enough to cover the flow width. If you digitize it small, you can get these oscillations of flow at both edges of the boundary, and you will get more like a spray type of flow out of the boundary rather than a nicely smooth flow. All these recommendations would also apply to downstream boundary. One more important thing about upstream boundary is to check that inflow is as expected. You would get a hydrograph from some hydrological model, then put it into your 2D model as upstream boundary, digitize a plot output, couple of cells away from the boundary, and check the hydrographs if it's matching. It's nicely matching on this plot, so we know that the boundary was applied correctly. If you have, for example, by mistake entered a flow that is for 1 in 50 year event instead of 1 in 100 event, then you would get the flow a bit lower and you would know immediately that something is wrong. If you have set up the boundary incorrectly or the time step is set up too large, you might get an unstable boundary, which would look similar to the plot here. That was all about upstream boundaries. The last recommendation that I have for the external boundaries is for a special type of downstream boundary, which is stage discharge boundary. This boundary is very sensitive to water surface slope and should be positioned well away from the area of interest. On this example, we have downstream boundary at the top side of the snapshot, and our area of interest is this road, which should be upgraded. We can pick 3 water surface slopes around the general bed level slope. For example, 0.1, 0.01, and 0.001%, and create impact assessments on all of those. These plots are showing us that neither the steep slope, 0.1, or the flat slope, 0.001, is creating any difference at the location of our boundary, which means that we could really use any of these slopes for the model. There is another, we could also assess the slope by comparing the water level contours. Here I have contours on water level every 0.2 meters. And if we look at these 3 examples, it is visible that for the steepest boundary, the water level contours are getting too fine at the location of the boundary, which means that the boundary will be sucking down the water level a bit too much. On the other hand, for the flat slope, there are almost no water level contours at the location of the boundary, which suggests the boundary might be holding up the water level a bit too high. So the mid-range slope, 0.01%, seems to be just right. Next recommendation is about material spatial resolution. So in your models, you will have your materials defined, possibly as polygons, for the creek and the road. But if you run your model with cell size that is too big for the model, you might get this not consecutive flow path for the creek and also not representing the road materials correctly. Why is that? If we zoom into this location and display cell centers, the materials will only get updated for the cells where the cell center falls within the polygon, the material polygon. So this will suggest we should get our cell size smaller. We can do it easily with quadtree just by using a quadtree polygon. I have used a cell size 5, 2.5, and 1.25 meters within the creek. And if we zoom into this location, we get nice representation of the material flow path because we have smaller cell size at the location where we actually need it, not in the whole model. Break lines is the next very important part of the model. You should digitize them for every road, levee, embankment that you have in the model, particularly if the cell size is larger than the structure itself, or if you are using a subgrid sampling. Here I have an animation for scenario without break lines on the left and with break lines on the right. So let's play the animation and have a look what happens. Water's coming in, reaching the road, starting to pile up behind the road, and already overtopping the break line on the left in the left model, and only now overtopping the road in the model on the right. So there is significant difference between the runtimes. If you want to do your modeling correctly, you should be inserting break lines everywhere where it's required. If you see a flow overtopping a road, you should be asking yourself if there should be a 1D feature underneath the road, for example, a culvert or bridge. Here I have a simulation which does have a culvert included in the model. So let's run another animations. Water's coming in, reaching the culvert and almost immediately conveying the water from one side of the embankment to another. That's what we want. And once the culvert fills up, then water again starts to pile up behind the embankment and overtops. Now that we have a culvert inserted in our model, we should check if it is working correctly. We use a lot of tools in QGIS. This one is from the 2Flow plugin, applying stability checking style to current layer. My model that I have shown you and zoomed into the location for the animation on Culvert 1 has actually 3 culverts. And from the legend that the styling is giving us, it shows that that particular culvert is stable, but we have a culvert number 3 in the model, which is showing likely unstable. And that suggests to us to go in and review it a bit more closely. So I have run the model with particularly high time step, around 1 second for the 1D features. And already, as the tool suggested, there are some instabilities. So the blue plot is flow versus time. The red plot is velocity versus time. And that's not particularly nice result to get. So I will make the time step smaller and run the model again. And with mid-range time step, 0.5 seconds, I get these nice flows, smooth flows and velocities throughout the culvert. To confirm that this option, that this time step can be used, I will also run a small time step, possibly 0.1 second for this model, to confirm that the flows and the velocities are exactly the same as the case above. And if they are, I can agree to adopt the mid-range time step. That's all I wanted to share with you guys. I will invite Bill back to give you some final notes on the presentation.
Okay, just to wrap up, everyone. Sorry for these mishaps. So why do we flood model? Well, we do it to inform our decision makers. And the thing to just keep in mind is that the accuracy of our modeling has a very big impact on their decisions. So yeah, it's all about accuracy. And to have accurate modeling, you need to be solving the physics well, and certainly in accordance to what you're modeling. And if you get into more complex hydraulic space, you really need to have a good scheme. Benchmarking calibration underpins everything. That's the proof of whether your model does the right stuff. And if you don't have the luxury of benchmarking or calibration, it's also good to do these tests, such as cell size results convergence. Change your cell sizes down, and if you're getting different answers, then you need to keep converging down. Because you can have 2D cell sizes in particular that are too large. The same principle also applies to 1D as well. Time step convergence, that's another thing that's good to check now and then. If you change your time step, do you get the same results? And also, that might be part of your stability checking process. Look, in most flood models, the diffusive wave solution is not appropriate, but it can be if it's a fairly benign system. But in most flood models, you really need to be in the second order solvers that include inertia and subgrid turbulence. Ultimately, it's about putting good information into your model, good, accurate ground elevation data, bathymetry data, make sure your boundaries are behaving well, understand any uncertainty around the inflows, because often they can be quite substantial, particularly for calibration events. If you're using stage discharge boundaries, keep them well downstream, do those sensitivity tests that Pavlina was showing before. Structures, yeah, well, that's another whole discussion, but representing structures well will make a good model. And keep your parameter values, your Manning's N values, your bend losses within inside industry norms. Because if you find you have to use an outside industry norm value, that is a red flag that something else is wrong. And look at your results. Just spend time looking at results. Do they look right? I've got water going over a cliff here. Is that real? Just look at your results. And also listen to your community. They, particularly the old timers or the people who experience floods, they know what happened and they'll tell you what happened. Great source of information. So look, there's a whole heap of other webinars which I've given in the past. We're sort of doing this one-on-one, one after all the more advanced webinars. But if you get into it and you need to know more about any of those topics on the screen, dive into those webinars. You can access them via the 2Flow website or via the AWS website. They're all there for you to watch free. And thank you to everyone for listening. And sorry about the connection problems.
Fantastic, Bill. Thanks. Really good, Pavlina. What a feast. I mean, you can't believe how much background is going on here. It's huge. I can see the years and years of flood modelling and general modelling and engineering background that's gone into this. So we are just, we've just had a feast. It's been fantastic. Thanks everyone for your really close discussion. Chris, is there a question that stands out?
Yeah, look, I've taken down a few. I might just try and list off three that cover different aspects of modelling. The first one, which got a few likes, is if someone is a floodplain manager who aren't actually handy with the tools, but are making decisions from the modelling results, what should they really look out for to know if the results are reliable and trustworthy? Anything, Bill, Pavlina, Phil, you could recommend in that regard?
Well, it's all about just, experience and reviews and keeping your parameters within standard normal ranges, and doing those basic tests, like just make sure that your model, if the cell size is not an issue, like your cell sizes aren't too large to produce accurate results. And once again, I don't mean your whole model. Often a model goes well beyond the area of interest. So it's all about getting the hydraulics right as well as you can in your area of interest. So there's lots of sensitivity tests you can do, and we've touched on the basic ones today to just make sure that some of those assumptions in your modeling are not affecting your results. So that's really what's really important as a modeler. And the more you do that, the more experience you get and the less you have to do it over time. And listen to, get people to review your work, particularly old timers like me. So, yeah.
Bill,
another one, Chris?
Add anything?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, look, another topical one is, where do you see the future path of flood modelling? Is AI and machine learning being used in this space to improve forecasting and modelling?
Oh, it's going to be a strong contribution, particularly, I think, in the ability to quality control models, but it will require very good information being fed into these AI machine learning processes, because it's very, if they get bad information or bad recommendations, bad practices feeding into what the guidance they're going to give, then that's not good. The other thing that this area can really help with is helping with calibration. So once again, it's about coming up with a set of parameters that fine-tunes your calibration, and so that often involves running lots and lots of simulations. So you can probably start to automate that process. But once again, it'd be very important that those parameters are staying within inside proper bounds and not just picking a number because it gives the right answer. Because if you use the wrong Mannings-Yen for calibrating to a small flood, your results for your very large flood will be completely wrong. So you really need to use the right values.
I wonder if we should leave it there in the interest of time.
Okay, let's do it.
We'll answer all the questions afterwards, and then we'll provide them back to AWS to post online.
That's a great way to go, Chris. That's an excellent way to go. Yep. No, look, it's been fantastic. And we will have this recording link emailed to you, uploaded to your website, YouTube channel. You'll also, as a live attendee, get emailed a certificate of attendance within 2 business days. And stay online just for a 1-minute short survey. We'd really like to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for your attendance today, and particularly for the discussion. It's been so deep. And as one person said, what a wealth of experience has come out today. It's been absolutely fantastic. Just to wrap up, webinars, live courses, and on-demand courses, you can see on the screen there. It's a huge range and depth of experience around water modelling, water management. So glad everybody could be here today, and from all 8 of us to everyone listening and being a part of this webinar, thanks Bill, thanks Chris, thanks Pavlina, thanks Phil, and from the Australian Water School and myself and Nushri, Joel and Renee, it's been an absolute Ben-Hur experience, huge. So I'll wrap it up there, and hope to see you at a webinar coming up soon. Thanks very much, everybody. See you again.